Let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what happens when the dead don't stay quiet? My uncle works as a forensic pathologist, a man who has seen death in all its raw, cold forms. He's used to the silence of the morgue, the faint hum of machinery, the stillness that almost feels sacred. But sometimes, he says, it's not the bodies that unsettle him, it's the things that happen around them. Things that defy logic, that make his pulse quicken and the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. These moments creep into his mind during the quietest hours, when the weight of the unknown presses hardest. He tells me that death is supposed to be final, a line drawn firmly in the sand. But what if, sometimes, it isn't? What if the line blurs, and something lingers on the other side, trying to claw its way back? These aren't questions a scientist like my uncle likes to dwell on, but he's seen enough to know there are things beyond explanation. This isn't just science, it's something far darker. Something unnatural. Something that stays with him long after he's left the morgue, haunting the corners of his thoughts. My uncle told me about this case from a few years ago. A man had been found in a car wreck, his body charred beyond recognition but still intact enough for examination. The air in the autopsy room was heavy, thick with the acrid, almost metallic tang of burnt material that clung to every surface. Even the filtered hum of the ventilation system couldn't fully clear it. Every breath felt labored, as though the air itself carried the weight of the tragedy. My uncle always said the morgue was a quiet place, but that day, the silence felt unnatural, oppressive, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As he prepared to start the autopsy, he noticed it, a sound so faint it was almost drowned out by his own heartbeat. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of the mind. The long hours, the flickering fluorescent lights, the monotony of his routine, all these things played on his nerves from time to time. But the sound didn't fade. It grew louder, like a ripple turning into a wave, each crest carrying with it an unshakable sense of unease. It wasn't just noise. It was a voice. Warbled, guttural, as though it were emerging from a well of water. The word it spoke was garbled but unmistakable. Help! Help! He froze, his gloved hand hovering inches above the scalpel. The sterile tools gleamed under the artificial light, but all he could focus on was that sound. It didn't seem to come from a specific direction. Instead, it reverberated through the room, as if the walls themselves were breathing it into existence. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, a biting chill creeping into his hands despite the gloves. He looked around, his eyes scanning the room for anything that could explain it. The corners of the room felt darker, the shadows heavier, as if something unseen lingered there. His assistant was called in, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud as she entered. She paused mid-stride, her face contorting in disbelief as the voice reverberated again. Help! Help! She whispered in unison with the sound, her voice trembling as though she could feel it crawling across her skin. The plea wasn't just audible, it felt tangible, an oppressive force that pressed down on their chests and sent shivers racing along their spines. The air itself felt heavier, as though it had been charged with something unexplainable. My uncle cautiously approached the body. The man's charred face was locked in a grotesque grimace, his mouth slightly ajar as if frozen in the middle of a scream. The burn marks twisted the features into something barely human, something nightmarish. But here's the thing that still makes my uncle shudder: the man's vocal cords had been destroyed, completely obliterated in the fire. There was no physical mechanism for the sound to exist. It defied reason, standing in direct opposition to everything he thought he knew. The moments that followed were a blur, he said. He worked quickly, his actions precise yet rushed, as though lingering too long in the presence of the body might invite something far worse. He didn't look at the face again. He didn't dare. Every small sound, his tools clinking, the faint whir of machinery, felt amplified, distorted, as though the room itself was reacting to his presence. By the time the body was sent for cremation the next day, he thought the ordeal was over. But it wasn't. For weeks afterward, he avoided the autopsy room after hours. The whispers, soft, fragmented, almost indistinguishable from the low hum of the morgue's machinery, persisted. Sometimes, they seemed to come from the corners of the room, where shadows pooled like ink, darker than they should have been. Other times, they were right behind him, brushing against his ear with the icy chill of breath that shouldn't exist. Help! Help! It would say, always in that same distorted, watery tone. The shadows seemed to shift when no one was looking, their edges blurring as if something was moving within them. The worst time, he told me, was when he swore he heard it one last time, weeks after the body had been reduced to ashes. This time, it came from the corridor outside his office. He stepped out, flashlight in hand, the beam sweeping across the narrow, dimly lit hallway. The light caught on nothing but the faint flicker of the emergency exit sign at the end of the hall. And yet, the air felt charged, like the static before a storm. The oppressive stillness returned, so heavy it felt like gravity itself had doubled. He called out, his voice shaky, but no answer came. Just the stillness. And then, faintly, so faint he thought he imagined it, the whisper again, "Help." It wasn't just the whispering that haunted him. It was the silence that followed, deep, heavy, and suffocating, as though the morgue itself had swallowed the sound whole. He could never quite shake the feeling that the walls had absorbed whatever presence lingered, holding it like a prisoner. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would pause in the hallway outside that room and feel it, waiting, listening, its presence heavy and patient, as though it was waiting for someone to return and hear its plea. Another time, he was working late when the power went out in the morgue. That wasn't uncommon, he said, storms often messed with the grid. But this time, something felt different. The backup generator, which usually roared to life within seconds, stayed silent. The morgue plunged into absolute darkness, the kind so thick it felt almost tangible, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. The air was cold, carrying the faint metallic tang of disinfectants mingling with the chill of the refrigeration units. Even the faintest sounds, his own breathing, the distant hum of machinery winding down, seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. The silence was profound, like the entire world outside had vanished, leaving only him and the shadows. He fumbled for his flashlight, its click echoing sharply against the stillness, an unnatural sound in the heavy air. The beam sliced through the blackness, illuminating shapes that were too familiar yet strangely alien in the dark. The sterile metal slabs glinted coldly under the light, their surfaces almost too clean, almost alive in their unnatural reflection. His hands trembled slightly as he moved the flashlight across the room, each shadow seeming to shift and stretch as if unwilling to stay still. The walls lined with cabinets loomed taller than usual, their edges dissolving into the darkness. Yet everything felt wrong, like the room had expanded and contracted all at once, subtly distorted as if seen through warped glass. His pulse quickened as the light caught on something near one of the slabs, a shadow. But it wasn't a trick of the light, nor did it shift as he adjusted the flashlight. It stood tall, unnaturally defined, its edges unervingly crisp and unyielding against the beam, as though the light was absorbed into it rather than reflected. It didn't belong. The air grew heavier, pressing down on him like an unseen force, almost suffocating. His breath hitched as he stared, frozen by the sight. It wasn't just a shadow, it felt aware. It seemed to pulsate faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if it were watching him, observing his every move. He felt it, a low, thrumming presence in the room, like the vibration of something far away yet uncomfortably close. Every rational part of him screamed to leave, to run, to get out, but something stronger, a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, held him in place. He stepped closer, his every movement exaggerated in the suffocating silence, each footstep an unnatural echo that didn't match the dimensions of the room. The shadow remained unmoving, yet it vibrated subtly, like a heartbeat just beneath the surface of the darkness. He stopped inches from the slab, the smell of disinfectant and cold steel filling his nostrils, but beneath it lingered something else, faint and wrong, an earthy, decayed odor that hadn't been there moments before. His fingers, trembling, tightened around the flashlight as he leaned closer, his breath fogging in the unnaturally cold air. Just then, the power surged back on. The overhead lights flickered violently before flooding the room with their harsh, sterile glow, and the steady hum of machinery roared back to life, filling the void. But the shadow was gone. He exhaled sharply, his breath visible in the unnaturally cold air, but relief was fleeting. He turned back to the slab, preparing to resume his work, willing himself to focus. That's when his relief turned to dread. The body on the slab, motionless and lifeless moments before, now had its head tilted sharply to the side, its eyes wide open and staring directly at him. His heart pounded as he stood frozen, his mind racing. He swore the head had been facing upward when he had begun. The cold, lifeless eyes seemed to lock onto his own, though he knew they could see nothing. Yet, it felt as though they were boring into him, pulling him into their empty, endless void, as if beckoning him closer. His breath quickened, his hands trembling violently as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The room felt colder than ever, the chill biting into his skin as though it were alive, creeping and crawling along his arms and neck. He stumbled backward, unable to tear his eyes away from the body. The edges of his vision blurred, the bright lights of the room dimming as though the shadows were reaching out to consume everything. His mind raced to rationalize what he was seeing, but nothing made sense. The silence returned, deep and suffocating, broken only by the faint, irregular hum of the refrigeration units, now seeming like a distant, otherworldly drone. For weeks after, he refused to enter that room. Even passing by its doorway made his skin crawl, as though an unseen presence lingered just beyond the threshold, waiting for him to cross it. Every step he took near that hall felt weighted, the air thick with something he couldn't explain, an unrelenting pressure that clung to him even after he left. Even now, he says he feels it, like eyes following him from the edges of the shadows, always watching, waiting for the lights to fail again. And when they do, he wonders if the shadow will return, waiting for the perfect moment to step closer. The morgue has rules, my uncle always says. One of them is to never ignore a phone that rings late at night. Why? Because of what happened to him years ago. It was an unusually quiet evening. The kind of silence that makes every small noise, the ticking of a clock, the creak of a chair, seem deafening. The air in the morgue had a strange quality that night, heavier than usual, as if something unseen was pressing down on the atmosphere. Then, it happened. The phone in the morgue rang, its shrill tone slicing through the stillness like a jagged blade. My uncle reached for it, expecting a routine call from law enforcement or perhaps an update on a case. Instead, he was met with static. Not ordinary static, but a deep, crackling distortion that seemed to pulse, almost breathing, as if it were alive. And then came the voice. Soft, trembling, and unmistakably human. "I'm not supposed to be here," it said, each word drawn out, dripping with despair. The sound was faint yet clear, like a whisper carried on a breeze that didn't exist. The words crawled into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like vines, and sent a chill racing down his spine. His hand gripped the receiver so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He tried to respond, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who is this? Are you okay?" But before he could say more, the line went dead with a hollow, echoing click. The silence that followed felt heavier than the static, an oppressive weight that pressed down on him, suffocating and absolute. He stared at the phone in his hand, its cord twisting like a lifeline to nowhere, swaying ever so slightly as if touched by unseen fingers. Here's the part that still unsettles him. That phone wasn't connected to any external line. It was purely internal, meant only for calls within the building. There was no logical explanation for what had just occurred. He set the receiver down, his hands trembling, his breath uneven, and forced himself to check the records. He needed answers. What he found made his breath catch. The body in the next room belonged to a young woman, recently brought in after being declared dead at a nearby hospital. She had no known family and no visitors, no one who could have called about her. And yet, the voice on the phone matched her profile. Young. Fragile. Desperate. Her file described her as suffering from severe hypothermia, a detail that now felt too significant to ignore. That wasn't the only thing. When he reviewed the call log, he noticed something even stranger. The phone hadn't registered any incoming call. The line should have been silent, disconnected, and yet the voice was unmistakable, lingering in his memory like a ghostly echo. This discovery only deepened the chill in his veins, planting a seed of dread that took root and grew with every passing moment. For days after, he avoided answering the phone during his shifts, letting it ring until someone else picked up or the noise stopped on its own. But late at night, when the morgue was silent, he swore he could still hear faint whispers emanating from the phone's receiver, even when it wasn't ringing. A soft, trembling echo. "I'm not supposed to be here." The sound wasn't always clear, it would ebb and flow, sometimes blending with the hum of the equipment, but it was always there, just on the edge of perception. One night, curiosity, or perhaps a need for closure, got the better of him. He stayed late, alone, waiting for the phone to ring. When it finally did, the sound startled him, cutting through his frayed nerves like a knife. He answered, his voice trembling. This time, the static was louder, more invasive, and the voice that followed was clearer than ever before. "Please, help me. I'm cold." The words hit him like a blow, the desperation in the tone sinking deep into his chest. It wasn't a request, it felt like a plea, a desperate attempt to reach across a barrier that shouldn't exist. He checked the log again afterward, and once more, the call didn't exist. Shaken, he returned to his office, but the feeling lingered. The air in the morgue seemed colder, heavier, as if the temperature had dropped without reason. He swore he saw the phone's receiver move ever so slightly, as if waiting for him to pick it up again, daring him to engage. My uncle always claims he doesn't believe in ghosts. He's a man of science, grounded in the physical and the tangible. But after that call, and the ones that followed, he'll admit, in the quietest of voices, that he's no longer so sure. And every time he passes that phone, a part of him wonders if it's waiting for someone else to answer. These are just a few of the stories my uncle has shared, and he says there are more he hasn't dared to tell anyone. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, one thing's for certain, the dead might not be as silent as we think. Now it's your turn. Do you believe these are just coincidences? Or is there truly something lurking in the shadows of the morgue? Let me know in the comments. Your perspective could unlock another layer to these mysteries. If you're as intrigued by these haunting tales as I am, make sure to hit the like button. It helps us bring more eerie stories to light. Don't forget to subscribe for more spine-chilling content like this, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the unexplained. And if this story gave you goosebumps, share it with someone who loves a good scare. Let's keep the conversation, and the chills, alive.